Alright my darlings, so we're here one last time, and I have to admit I am getting a little bit teary-eyed. I mean, we've been through so much together, and now's the last time I get to talk bollocks about Farthing Wood. But we're not going to get anywhere with me being all sentimental. Let's get into the overview episode, and let's start with where we always do, the story. The story this year is going to be a bit tricky to talk about, not just because it's split three ways, that's not dissimilar to the way the story was presented to us last year, but there is one thing that all three of these stories in Series 3 suffer from: lack of focus. This was a minor problem in Series 2, where there were so many characters that some of the elements of the story were a tad unfocused, or their endings felt a bit abrupt. They clearly addressed this part of the problem this time, because there are many characters from the last two series, like the rabbits, the original hares, the squirrels, Mateless and Paddock, who are either given a minuscule amount of screen time or aren't in this series altogether, which definitely helped with the focus a little bit, but this time the lack of focus is essentially that all the subplots desire equal amounts of attention, so they essentially fight each other to all be featured in the episode, to the point where they don't feel very interconnected at all. When we cut between Fox and Bold's stories last time, it did seem slightly awkward, but the stories were kept very well interconnected, and each subplot was given the right amount of time to develop. Whereas here, there are some small attempts to segue into the other narratives, but more often than not we just cut to them out of nowhere, which is really distracting and disorientating. Not helped that if you were getting into the subplot you were watching, and then it cuts the one you weren't interested in, it can get even more annoying. Not helped by the fact that every one of the subplots is overloaded with comic relief, a majority of them that aren't very funny. The transitions to the subplots in this series are very similar to the transitions to the songs in Frozen. Great songs and a great movie overall, but they do seem to come out of nowhere. But with that said, how are the subplots themselves? Well, best to start with the worst first in my book, which means the Weasel subplot. Even though I don't find Weasel and Measley that annoying on their own, when we have to spend half the episode with them and their little shitbags of kids, and then we're accompanied by two characters who are even more annoying than they are, it's hard not to want to shove a spike through your ear and have it poke out the other one on the other side. This is a story that the very premise was dead on arrival, regardless if it was to test to see if the Weasels could potentially hold their own series, which quite frankly is a terrifying prospect in of itself, and nothing about the subplots is enjoyable, with the exception of the animation, which does greatly improve in the series overall, even if the designs do look rather abstract and cartoony, which doesn't fit Farthing Wood. But it is nice to look at the very least, in that it's good to see them not reusing the same models, frames and cells over and over again like they did in the last two series. Either way, sometimes the Wildcats are fun to watch as well, but they're only in 2 episodes and then promptly disappear, so if you're really going to watch this series as a whole, you have to have the fast forward button on the ready. Fox's story, on the other hand, suffers from a completely different problem. The Weasels may have been annoying, but you understood from the start that they were supposed to be the main characters of the story. Who is the main character in this story arc? Is it Fox? If he is, he's rather lazy and useless protagonist. Is it Plucky? If so, he spends most of this half of the series absent and only appears every once in a while, so he's quite an infrequent hero. Is it Bully? We see him more than any of the other characters, and it would be interesting to have a villain as the protagonist, but we certainly aren't supposed to root for him. Is it Spike? He has a great bit of character development, but he's not made the main focus. Is it Vixen? She's the narrator, but she barely does anything. Is it Dash? Again, she's a great character, but she kind of ducks in and out of the action. This is the major problem with this year's major story arc, in that there are so many characters trying to fight for the role of protagonist that none of them feel like the main character. Even Fox, who's supposed to be the main character of the show overall, doesn't feel like the main character this series. This is one of the situations where the multiple stories with the other characters makes a little sense, since having them split up from the main story means that there are less characters in White Deer Park to steal attention away from the main ones, but their stories steal screen time from the main characters anyway. Regardless of the lack of focus, there are still things to be enjoyed about this story arc, even if the pacing and narrative aren't as good as the last ones. Fox is still Fox, even if he is very old and tired. He still has his awesome moments. Toad still gets some great bits of character development, which also develops Spike, who is one of the most unique Farthing Wood characters to date. Dash is great and is utilised well as a character, which is more than can be said for her dad. Plucky is awesome, almost to a cartoonish degree of how useful he is in the crisis, though his disappearance in the middle of the series is a bit daunting, but it only lasts a brief moment. And Laird is awesome too, even if he's only in a few of the last episodes. Most of the other Farthing Wooders aren't utilised at all, other than to pipe in conversations every once in a while for no reason, especially Friendly, who might as well not even been in this series, and Charmer and Ranger feel like there was such wasted potential, either being able to have a family of their own, or maybe some deep-seated late prejudice towards Ranger since he's the last Blue Fox and Scarface's son, but it's nice to see them when they pop up, and Vixen and Whisper are rather interchangeable in terms of their character in the series and aren't really that useful, which is fine for Whisper, but it's a shame Vixen couldn't do more useful stuff this time around, especially given how much he's helped out in the last two series, and while he's not as good as Scarface was, Bully is actually a great villain. He is very different to Scarface, and he's obviously got more comedic relief elements to him than Old Blue did, but he does pose a legitimate threat and can be a little intimidating sometimes, though Trey doesn't quite land in that same street cred, though his presence does cause legitimate problems for the gang during the first half of the series, but the way both of them are defeated is extremely anticlimactic, though some of the action scenes throughout are quite fun, even if they feel distinctly neutered compared to the previous series, especially Series 2, and that applies to the whole of Series 3 and how they lightened up the dark elements, particularly evident in how Bully was defeated. I understand why they did that, but it just seems like a really clumsy juxtaposition to have this and then have this. It just doesn't work, not helped by the exponential wave of comic relief they put into this series, which either branched from mildly annoying to decent, to extremely annoying and wanting to top yourself while watching them, which probably either makes me brave or very stupid by the amount of times I brought out those two drills in this series. Though at the very least, this does mean that the characters aren't treated as disposable like they arguably were in the last series, and there's definitely a distinct lack of secondary character hunting, with the exception of Sinuous and the Great White Stag in that regard. And on the bright side, the arc ends on a perfect bookmark for the end of Farthing Wood as a whole. Despite that, Owl's story arc is probably my favourite. It's probably the best bit of character development for a single character that we've ever gotten in Farthing Wood. There are some refreshingly dark moments, especially seeing the aftermath of the hurricane. It's very emotional at times and very endearing, and while it can get a tad repetitive at times and even a little annoying, it does feel very enjoyable, and it's great to see some of the old Series 1 locations in the new animation style, especially to see what's happened to Farthing Wood, and it also brings in some of the old themes of danger being more of a concept and being all around you rather than from a single being, and going on a long journey that was in the first series. The Weasel subplot tried to do this too, but failed miserably, but Owl pulled it off, and it's also nice to see our favourite pompous old Owl get a happy ending for once. Overall, the story for this series isn't the best overall, but it is still Farthing Wood, even if the premise and the pacing isn't very good, and it does still have some of the gravitas that the original series did, and it's also the last time we'll actually get to see these characters, until the fanbase started making fan art and fan fiction. But regardless, it's definitely the worst series, but it's still Farthing Wood, and it's completely and utterly harmless in that regard. And now it's time to get into the characters of Farthing Wood. Isn't that right, Huck? Now this year I'm going to have to be even more vitriolic about what characters I do and don't talk about, since there were so many new characters added on top of the old ones, and so many of both new and old characters are so inconsequential that I really don't need to talk about them. So here's a brief montage of the characters I won't be talking about. So I'm only going to be talking about characters in this series who had actual development, actually had an impact on the story, and actually appeared for more than one episode. So sorry Leverett and Brat, you're not in this segment. But let's get things started underway with our favourite character as always, Fox.
Now out of all the foxes in White Deer Park, I'm the slowest.
Fox, as I made it clear in the reviews, is not the same Vulpus he was in the first two series. He acts tired, slightly curmudgeonly and all that, and for lack of a better term, old, and this makes him very uninvolved in the series, but to be honest, it's kind of what he should be like. Don't get me wrong, I don't really like seeing him like this, but in terms of the character, it does kind of make sense. After Badger's death, he, Toad and Vixen are now the oldest members of the Farthing Wood Elders, though why they don't act as tired as he does is a bit weird, but regardless, Fox is a character who has had had the weight and responsibility of several animals for 3 generations, which in Fox years is a lot, so he would be tired. And while his lack of involvement and either rather lazy and almost pathetic attitude isn't quite what we come to expect, this isn't too different to what happened to Badger at the end of his life. The only downside to that frame of looking is that besides seeing Fox sleeping a lot, which is all we see him do for most of the series, he never admits to himself about how old he is, and that could be seen as him being defiant about his age and still trying to be the great hero he's presented to be by rumour to other animals. And whether or not he internally knew how old he was, him passing leadership on to Plucky can be seen as his true self-admission of his age and how past it he is. I mean, literally, he actually says it in the scene. But it's clear to me, at least, that he knew, or at least had an inkling about how old and past it he was. But some more scenes about him admitting that and trying to figure out who the next leader would have been nice to see. But he does still have his foxy moments, particularly near the end, but otherwise he does fall down on the great woodland hero he's been over the past 2 series. Even if the way he's acting does make sense from a character point of view, it's not quite what we've come to expect, but it's nice to see him regardless.
Oh, Weasel, your little ones. They're so weaselly.
Vixen, on the other hand, shows no sign of her age, but then again, she doesn't show much sign of anything, like I said. She and Ranger had the bigger roles in the books in trying to pick up where Fox couldn't due to his age, but those roles were replaced more with Plucky, Dash, and some of the other minor characters. She is still sweet and endearing of a character that we've come to know, but it's a shame they didn't really give her much to do, which is why I think they gave her the narrator role, to make it seem like she was more involved in the action. However, that made me realise something later on, in that, much like the stag was, she was much more of an observer than a participant, and so she looked on more than attacked or fought, which does make sense. She's old and she does need to look after Fox, but we could have just as easily given that role to Ranger, Charmer, Friendly, or Whisper if that's where they were going with the idea. Hell, Shadow and Charmer actually do kill a lot of rats in this story. Vixen hardly does it at all, but it is nice to hear her comforting voice at the beginning of every episode. And if the episode opens up with the weasels, it feels like a parent or a therapist reassuring me before I go and do something painful. But either way, it is nice to see her. I just wish she did more, but that could come down to how there were so many other Fox characters at this point, hence why Friendly also suffered and essentially became forgotten by the writing team.
She may have gone far, far away, looking for a mate.
Oh, that's what she's up to. Well, I hope she's as lucky as I was.
Like I said before, Ranger and Charmer felt like a huge amount of wasted potential and how very little came out of them, but they do still, like all the characters, keep the elements of their personalities intact, so they are still the same couple that we loved the first time and do so now. It's just a shame that we never got to see what their cubs would look like. Purple foxes, people, I want to see one. That hasn't gone that colour because they've been rotting on the road, but oh well, don't worry guys, you'll always have your fans.
When I lived in town, I ate nothing but rats. I'm used to them. But him... Ugh.
Whisper basically does 2 things in this series: help the animals fight the rats, and act the protective mother figure to Plucky. That's it. And while it's nice to see her character change a lot from the bitch she was in the last series, this change happens between series, so we don't see how the change happened. She's just like this from the first time we see her. And like Friendly, it does baffle me why they even brought her back in the first place, but at least her mother role was made a tad more important than him.
Go on, I'm cleverer than him.
Friendly's Friendly, that's all you need to know. He only appears twice and he barely does anything those 2 times, which is so pointless that in many of the fan fictions I've read they've either tried to give him more of a role or make fun of how useless he was in Series 3.
Sly fox, aren't I?
Plucky is by far the best character in the series, showing from the start that he's headstrong, fit, clever, ambitious, and always up for a challenge, combining the best elements of both his dad and his granddad with his character. Those in turn lead to some of the best moments in Series 3, with his Bat Fox out of nowhere saviour moments and how he seems to succeed in everything he does. Which is really the only downfall for his character, in that he never seems to fail in anything he tries at. Which I guess in that regard makes him more Super Fox than Bat Fox, but much like Superman, it's great to see him just kick some ass and save the day. But it would have been nice to see him go through more levels of emotion and difficulty, but his lack of challenge in facing impossible odds is probably why Fox gave him the title of the new leader, alongside clearly seeing a lot of himself when he was a young man in him, plus the nepotism of how he's his actual grandson. His friendship with Dash, as well as being one of the best parts of Series 3, is a clear sign of the oath succeeding in White Deer Park, with natural sworn enemies like Hare and a fox being best friends. Plucky is the true successor of the ideals from Farthing Wood, and thus Plucky, while lacking any interesting elements in his development, is definitely the best character in the series. With the exception of one for me.
You're a wonky, useless old pigeon, that's what!
Dash is actually my favourite character in Series 3. Her very energetic, optimistic and childlike nature is very infectious, and so it becomes hard not to like her, much like Judy in Zootopia. Oh, I actually got one more Zootopia gag in there. Yay! Though on that note, I always felt that Judy Hopps and her parents looked more like hares than rabbits, which might have made for some interesting Farthing Wood fanfiction. Now that I've said it, it's going to happen, isn't it? She does help out a lot in this series, finding out the second part, causing the stampede to save Toad, and even coming up with some of the plans to sort out the problems, which is why I think they gave her a lot of focus in this series, and her voice is very well done too. Pamela Kiewicz achieves the perfect mid-range between annoying and charming that makes her voice really great to listen to, which is ironic because she does almost the exact same voice for Cleo, and her friendship with Plucky is one of the most endearing and genuine in the whole show, and it is one of the highlights of Series 3, although that memory is a bit soured by the amount of Plucky X Dash fanfiction and fan art that I've seen to last me a lifetime. And probably an afterlife at that matter as well.
Don't worry, I'm your friend.
I've said before, even though I'm not the biggest hater of Hercule, he's definitely not a character I like. His extremely repetitive dialogue, annoying voice and tendency to pop out of nowhere to ruin the scene is not very likeable, and fills the hole that Badger left poorly. Badger had his slightly senile moments and was a bit short-sighted to obvious things, but he wasn't this dumb, and he was still wise and brash sometimes and had multiple levels to him. Hercule just says, "I'm kind," and that's it. Why does he keep having to qualify that? Did he do something horrible in his life and he's trying to atone for? If that is the case, that would have been interesting to see, and it would have made his pacifist nature genuinely endearing and a little bit funny. But no, this is all we see of him. I did joke in the last episode about him being like a Care Bear, but now that I think about it, wouldn't it be funny if a Care Bear actually did come down from Care-a-Lot and turned into a badger? Kind Heart Badger or something like that. On that note, I've seen many fan creations of Farthing Wood, as I've made clear in the past, and one of them was an idea of having a main villain be a badger, which made me think of what if Spike and Hercule's roles were swapped. Have Spike being a rat who isn't with Bully from the start and having him trying to get validation that he's a nice rat, and Hercule as a double agent who turns out to have been feeding information to the rats all along. That would have made his character way more interesting and would have been one hell of a plot twist, which is something we don't really get in Farthing Wood. But as is, we're stuck with what he's got, that being an irritating old fool who doesn't know when to shut up.
That beastie has no better nature.
Not too much to say about Shadow in this series, except that she plays the straight man, or wife rather, to Hercule's buffoon character, and adds the double act by filling in the level-headed and sensible side that Badger left behind, which is nice, but we don't see her all that often, so she doesn't really get a chance to be that character. But she still is nice to see, and listening to the voice done by a woman or man that no one can still identify. Did they go into witness protection or something? That seems way too black and white to me. I had to get one more in, come on.
I'm too old for this.
Whistler is very underutilised in this series, and there's virtually no character development outside of him complaining that he's old, but that only lasts for one episode, and really the only reason I'm talking about him here is because he's one of the few characters from the first series who's still around that actually does anything vaguely useful or interesting, but it's such a shame to see one of my favourite characters completely wasted in this series.
I want to coil up somewhere and...
You're a lazy worm, Sinuous.
Ada, on the other hand, is utilised greatly and has a huge amount of development for this series, and of course that all comes down to her mate, Sinuous, who is also a great character and one of the few new characters who isn't a pain in the arse, and has that great Alan Rickman voice. Though he does seem to act a bit absent-minded at times, which of course is what led him to being killed in a way that is not too unlike the way Dreamer died in the second series, except here we actually see it on screen. Sort of. But Sinuous was always playing second fiddle to Ada's more dominant side anyway, and I think I would have been too if I was with Ada. But she still is awesome, still the same headstrong, vicious predator she's always been. Even when she becomes torn apart by Sinuous's death, she still stays her vicious self out of retaliation. In fact, it almost makes her psychotic in some capacity, which makes it all the more sadder when you consider that she didn't really get to have true revenge on Bully, or even the actual rat that killed Sinuous. She also seems to have disappeared after the final battle, which is rather disappointing, but she still had a great presence and journey through this series in general, and never really changed from the character that we all know and love.
I forgive you, matey.
Oh, thank
Thank you.
Whilst Toad's development is more directed towards the development of another character in the series, I do feel that it was a well-chosen character for this part of the story. Toad may be a tad naive, possibly even a tad stupid, but he's got a warm heart, and in many ways upholds the oath of Farthing Wood more than any of the other characters, always looking to see the good in people and looking to help them out, which makes Hercule's character one of the more useless when he's essentially doing the same thing, just much worse. Toad's journey with Spike is mostly played for comic relief, but it can work in that regard because Spike is actually a naturally funny guy, and it does make the darker moment of when Bully attacks Toad a bit more daunting, and makes Spike's feelings of guilt all the more believable, and brings us to one of the more emotional parts of the series after that, even if the bit where Toad forgives Spike is a bit limp and feels tacked on at the end, but I still feel that it did really work. It's one of the few bits of original writing not from the books in this series that the writers actually managed to properly pull off. While Toad may not have the greatest amount of character development, though you could argue that he was more cautious to trust people on the first sight after Spike, which does make you wonder why he did so in the first place, given that it was him that was trying to convince the others that there were rats in the park in the first place. The arc that he goes through with Spike is genuinely enjoyable and endearing, and seeing Spike stand up for Toad at the end in the final battle was awesome, who is still one of the most well-developed characters in Farthing Wood in my opinion. And while his story is vaguely similar to Ranger's in Series 2, Ranger still stayed on the side of his father the whole time, which made Spike the first ever character in Farthing Wood to switch sides in a conflict and go from a villain to a hero. And again, it genuinely works, and it's great to see Spike genuinely helping out the Farthing Wood gang at the end, which is quite the contrast from the books given that he killed Mossy in the books during the final battle. And that is also still a better send-off than his dad got. Speaking of which...
Bang, bang! You're dead, rat!
Mossy doesn't really have any development in this series, or if he did, it happened between series, as he now has a fascination with riding on Badger's heads, which makes me think that he had a bit of a bout of longing and depression after Badger passed away last series, which would have been a great bit of character development to see, but like I said, it all happened off screen between series. Great bit of writing there, guys. But as a character, he's okay, even if he doesn't have a lot to do, and he's definitely got a lot more of an attitude than his dad did, which makes sense since he's basically a young adult. But like most of the smaller characters, he's basically comic relief, as if we didn't have enough of that already.